The gavel hit the wooden block with a sound that echoed through the courthouse like a church bell at midnight. But all I could focus on was my father's face, twisted into that familiar smirk he wore whenever he thought he'd outsmarted everyone in the room. He sat 3 chairs away from me, his arm wrapped possessively around a woman half his age, her manicured fingers resting on what she claimed was his baby. Earlier that morning, he'd strutted through the courthouse lobby like a peacock showing off his feathers. His voice had carried across the marble floors when he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "After today, sweetheart, our little one might inherit everything this family built." The woman had giggled and pressed closer to him, her belly prominent beneath a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd watched this performance from across the waiting area, my hand steady around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. 28 years of living, with his manipulation, had taught me to recognize the show before the curtain even rose. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't the scared daughter who used to hide in her bedroom when his voice got too loud. This time, I had something he didn't know about. The inheritance hearing was supposed to be routine. Mom had passed 6 months earlier after a battle with cancer that lasted longer than anyone expected. Her will was clear, straightforward, written by a lawyer who'd known our family for decades. The house, the savings account, the small rental property downtown, everything was meant to come to me. Dad had been named executor only until I turned 25, and I'd passed that milestone 3 years ago. But routine had never been Dad's style. He thrived on drama the way other men thrived on sports or fishing. Within weeks of Mom's funeral, he'd started talking about contesting the will. He claimed Mom had been confused during her final months, that the pain, medication had clouded her judgment. He insisted she'd wanted him to have control of the estate, that leaving everything to me was a mistake that needed correcting. The woman beside him, Jessica, had appeared in our lives like a tornado touching down in a trailer park. She was 26, blonde, and had a way of looking at Dad like he was the most fascinating man who'd ever walked the earth. Within a month of meeting her at some church singles group, he'd moved her into the house Mom and I had shared. Within 2 months, she was announcing her pregnancy to anyone who'd listen. Now here we sat in Judge Morrison's courtroom, the morning sun streaming through tall windows that had witnessed decades of family disputes. The judge shuffled through papers with the methodical patience of a man who'd seen every possible variation of human greed and family dysfunction. Dad's lawyer, a thin man with nervous hands, kept checking his watch as if punctuality could somehow improve their case. My attorney, Sarah Chen, sat beside me with the calm confidence of someone who'd done her homework. She'd spent weeks gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, and building what she called an airtight case. But the most important piece of evidence sat in a manila envelope in her briefcase, sealed and waiting for the right moment. The hearing began with the standard formalities. Judge Morrison read the case number, confirmed everyone's identities, and outlined the basic facts. Mom's will dated 3 years before her death. Dad's petition to contest it filed 6 weeks after her funeral. The claim that she'd been mentally incompetent when she'd signed the documents. Dad's lawyer stood first, his voice carrying that practiced tone lawyers use when they're trying to make a weak case sound stronger. He painted a picture of a grieving widower trying to honor his late wife's true wishes, a woman who'd been confused and influenced by pain medication in her final months. He talked about Dad's years of sacrifice, his devotion to the family, his right to provide for his unborn child. It was a performance worthy of community theater. Dad nodded along, his expression carefully arranged to show just the right amount of sorrow and determination. Jessica dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed the tears never quite materialized. When it was Sarah's turn, she approached the matter like a surgeon making precise incisions. She presented medical records showing Mom had been mentally sharp right up until her final week. She introduced testimony from the lawyer who'd drafted the will, confirming Mom had been alone and clear-headed when she'd signed it. She showed bank records proving Dad had already begun spending Mom's money before the will had even been probated. But the real revelation came when Sarah mentioned the paternity test. Dad's confident expression flickered for just a moment, like a candle flame in a sudden breeze. Jessica's hand tightened on his arm, her knuckles going white beneath her pink nail polish. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady as granite, "the petitioner's claim includes provisions for an unborn child allegedly fathered by Mr. Harrison. However, we have evidence that challenges this assertion." Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, his reading glasses catching the morning light. "What kind of evidence, Counselor?" Sarah reached for her briefcase. "DNA evidence, Your Honor, legally obtained and processed by an accredited laboratory." The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the heating system humming in the walls. Dad's lawyer stood up, objecting to the relevance of paternity in an inheritance dispute, but Judge Morrison waved him down with one hand. "I'll allow it," the judge said. "This case hinges partly on the petitioner's claim that his late wife would have wanted to provide for all of his children. The legitimacy of that claim is certainly relevant." That's when I saw something I'd never seen before in all my years of dealing with my father's schemes and manipulations. For the first time in his life, Dad looked genuinely uncertain. The smirk that had been his signature expression since I was a child began to crack around the edges. Jessica shifted in her seat, her hand moving protectively over her belly. But there was something in her eyes now, something that looked less like maternal instinct and more like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. Sarah walked the sealed envelope to the judge's bench, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown timer. Judge Morrison accepted the envelope with the same careful attention he'd given every other piece of evidence that morning. The paper rustled as he broke the seal. The courtroom held its collective breath as he unfolded the documents inside. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, his expression remaining professionally neutral even as the information sank in. When he finally looked up, his gaze settled first on Jessica, then on Dad. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. "According to these laboratory results," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "there is zero probability that Mr. Harrison is the biological father of the child in question." The words hit the room like a physical force. Someone in the gallery gasped. Dad's lawyer dropped his pen. Jessica's face went completely white, then flushed red as if she'd been slapped. But it was Dad's reaction that I'll remember for the rest of my life. The man who'd spent decades controlling every situation through sheer force of personality, who'd never met a room he couldn't dominate or a person he couldn't manipulate, sat frozen in his chair like someone had just explained to him that gravity had stopped working. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted from Jessica to the judge to me, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what he'd just heard. The smirk that had defined his face for as long as I could remember vanished completely, replaced by something raw and vulnerable that I'd never seen before. Jessica burst into tears, but they weren't the delicate, sympathetic tears she'd been attempting earlier. These were loud, messy sobs that echoed off the courtroom walls. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and ran toward the exit without looking back. Dad watched her go, his head turning slowly as if he was underwater. When the courtroom doors slammed shut behind her, he turned back to face the judge with the expression of a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse in real time. The truth has a weight to it that lies can never match. It settles into a room and changes the very air people breathe. As I sat there watching my father grapple with a reality he'd never seen coming, I felt something shift inside me too. This wasn't about revenge or getting even. This was about justice, finally finding its way home after years of wandering in the wilderness. Judge Morrison set the DNA results aside and picked up Mom's will again, his movements deliberate and final. The morning sun had moved across the courtroom windows, casting new shadows across the witness stand where truth had just taken up permanent residence. Residence? The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Dad sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The confident man who'd walked into this courtroom 3 hours ago had evaporated, leaving behind someone I barely recognized. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the matter at hand. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "do you have anything to say regarding these findings?" Dad's mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There. Must be some mistake. The lab mixed up the samples. These things happen all the time." Sarah stood up smoothly, her briefcase already open to the next set of documents. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit C, which includes chain of custody documentation from the laboratory. The samples were collected under supervised conditions with proper identification verification." She walked another folder to the judge's bench, her movements precise and unhurried. Dad watched her like a man watching his executioner sharpen the blade. Judge Morrison reviewed the new documents with the same methodical attention he'd given everything else. "The chain of custody appears to be properly documented," he said finally. "Mr. Harrison, these results indicate with scientific certainty that you are not the biological father of Ms. Parker's child." The name hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Jessica Parker. Even her name had been a lie, or at least a carefully curated version of the truth. I thought about all the times she'd sat at Mom's kitchen table, talking about baby names and nursery colors, spinning elaborate stories about the future she and Dad were going to build together. Dad's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but Dad shook his head violently. "No," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is impossible. Jessica told me. She swore to me." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment he sounded like the confused old man he was becoming rather than the manipulative patriarch he'd always been. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Morrison said, his tone gentle but firm, "the court understands this may be surprising information. However, these results directly impact your petition regarding the estate. Your claim that your late wife would have wanted to provide for this child is no longer relevant." That's when something broke inside Dad completely. Not just his composure, but something deeper. The foundation of whatever reality he'd been, living in for the past 6 months, crumbled like a house built on sand. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. I'd seen my father angry countless times. I'd seen him frustrated, disappointed, even occasionally embarrassed. But I'd never seen him cry. Not at Mom's funeral, not during her illness, not even when his own mother had passed years earlier. He'd always been too proud, too controlled, too convinced of his own invincibility. Now he sat in a public courtroom, sobbing like a child who'd just learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. The sound echoed off the paneled walls, raw and broken and utterly human in a way that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Sarah returned to her seat beside me, her expression professional but not unkind. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "given these revelations, we'd like to request that the court proceed with the original terms of Mrs. Harrison's will." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Before we conclude, I need to address the financial irregularities that were mentioned in the preliminary filings. Mr. Harrison, as executor of your wife's estate, you had certain fiduciary responsibilities." Dad lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. "I don't understand." Sarah opened another folder. "Your Honor, we've documented several concerning transactions from the estate accounts. Large withdrawals that coincided with casino visits, luxury purchases, and payments to Ms. Parker that appear to have no legitimate estate purpose." The hits kept coming like waves against a crumbling seawall. Dad stared at the documents Sarah was presenting as if they were written in a foreign language. "I was grieving," he said weakly. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "The law requires executors to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries regardless of their emotional state," Judge Morrison replied. "These withdrawals total nearly $40,000. Do you have documentation showing how this money was used for legitimate estate purposes?" Dad's silence was answer enough. He'd spent Mom's money on his fantasy life with Jessica, funding their trips to Atlantic City, buying her jewelry and clothes, probably even paying for the apartment she'd moved into when people started asking too many questions about their living situation. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have evidence that Mr. Harrison attempted to sell the rental property without proper authorization from the beneficiary. The buyer was prepared to pay significantly below market value, and the transaction was structured to avoid proper oversight. I remembered that phone call 3 weeks ago. Dad had called me at work, his voice casual and friendly in that way that always meant trouble. He'd mentioned something about a buyer for the downtown property, said it needed too much work and would be a burden for me to manage. He'd made it sound like he was doing me a favor by handling the sale, if Sarah hadn't been, monitoring the estate accounts. If I hadn't insisted on legal representation, he would have sold that property for a fraction of its worth and pocketed the money. The rental income from that building was supposed to provide me with financial security for years to come, just like Mom had planned. Judge Morrison set the financial documents aside and looked directly at Dad. Mr. Harrison, your conduct as executor has been deeply problematic. You've misappropriated funds, attempted unauthorized transactions, and misled this court about material facts. I'm removing you immediately from any remaining role in the estate administration. Dad flinched as if he'd been physically struck. You can't do that. I'm her husband. I have rights. You had responsibilities, the judge corrected. Responsibilities you failed to meet. The estate will now be administered directly by the beneficiary with appropriate legal oversight. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness wash over me. Relief. Because the nightmare was finally ending. Because Mom's wishes would be honored. Because I wouldn't have to fight anymore. But sadness, too. Because the man sitting 3 chairs away from me wasn't really my father anymore. He was just a broken old man who'd gambled away his dignity along with his wife's money. The judge turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Harrison, the court recognizes that this has been a difficult process. Your mother's will was clear and legally sound. The assets she intended for you will be transferred without further delay. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. Mom had known. Somehow she'd known that Dad would try to take everything, that he'd use his grief as an excuse to rewrite history. That's why she'd been so careful with the will, so specific about her intentions. There is one final matter, Judge Morrison continued. Mr. Harrison, the misappropriated funds must be repaid to the estate. You have 30 days to arrange restitution, or the court will be forced to pursue other remedies. Dad looked up with hollow eyes. I don't have $40,000. Then you'll need to find a way to obtain it, the judge said simply. Perhaps by selling some of the items you purchased with estate funds. I thought about the new car in Dad's driveway, the expensive watch he'd been wearing, the vacation photos he'd posted on social media. All of it bought with money that should have been mine. Money Mom had saved and planned and worried over during her final months. The gavel struck the wooden block one final time, and Judge Morrison declared the hearing concluded. People began gathering their papers and filing out of the courtroom, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of background noise. Dad sat motionless in his chair, staring at the table as if it might provide answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. His lawyer packed up quickly, avoiding eye contact as he mumbled something about billing and future communications. Even he seemed eager to distance himself from the wreckage of Dad's case. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady after sitting for so long. Sarah gathered her files with the efficient movements of someone who'd just completed a job well done. We should talk about the next steps, she said quietly. There are transfer documents to sign, accounts to close, properties to evaluate. But I wasn't listening to the practical details anymore. I was watching Dad, who still hadn't moved from his chair. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. The man who'd once seemed larger than life, who'd controlled every room he entered through sheer force of personality, had been reduced to this, a confused old man sitting alone in an empty courtroom, finally forced to face the consequences of his own choices. As we walked toward the exit, I heard him call my name. His voice was different now, stripped of its usual, commanding tone. "Sarah," he said, and then corrected himself. "I mean, honey, can we talk?" I stopped at the courtroom doors and turned back to face him. He was standing now, his suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. For a moment, I saw glimpses of the father I'd known as a small child, before Mom got sick, before the drinking got worse, before everything went wrong. "There's nothing left to talk about, Dad," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Mom's will is being honored. That's what she wanted." He took a step toward me, then stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. "I never meant for it to go this far. Jessica, she told me things. She made me believe." The excuse hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. I could have pointed out that Jessica hadn't forced him to steal from the estate. She hadn't made him lie to the court or try to manipulate me out of my inheritance. Those choices had been his alone. But I was tired of fighting, tired of being angry, tired of letting his mistakes define my life. "I know," I said simply, and I meant it. I did know. I understood exactly how Jessica had played him, how she'd fed his ego and his loneliness until he'd convinced himself that love and manipulation were the same thing. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a soft whisper of finality. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm on my face, and the air tasted clean in a way it hadn't for months. Sarah walked beside me toward the parking garage, already talking about timelines and paperwork, but her voice seemed to come from far away. I thought about Mom, about the last conversation we'd had before she got too sick to talk. She'd taken my hand in hers, her fingers thin and cold but still strong enough to squeeze tight. "Don't let him take what's yours," she'd whispered. "Promise me you'll fight for what's right." I'd promised, not really understanding what she meant at the time. Now I knew. She hadn't just been talking about money or property. She'd been talking about dignity, about standing up for truth even when it was uncomfortable, about refusing to let someone else's weakness become your burden. The parking garage echoed with the sound of our footsteps as we walked toward our cars. Sarah handed me a folder thick with documents and business cards. "This should be straightforward from here," she said. "The hard part is over." But as I drove home through streets I'd known my entire life, past the high school where I'd graduated, past the diner where Mom and I used to have breakfast on Saturdays, I realized the hard part wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because now I had to figure out how to build a life from the ashes of the one that had just burned down. How to honor Mom's memory while still finding a way to forgive the man who'd tried so hard to betray it. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though I'd taken the same route countless times. Every red light gave me another moment to replay the scene in the courtroom, Dad's face when the DNA results were read, the sound of Jessica's heels clicking frantically against the marble floor as she fled. The steering wheel felt cold under my hands, despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windshield. I pulled into the driveway of the small house I'd been renting since college, a modest place with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. It had always felt temporary, like a waiting room between childhood and whatever came next. Now, with Mom's house officially mine, I'd have to decide what came next meant. My phone buzzed as I sat in the car, staring at the front door I'd walked through 1,000 times before. A text from my cousin Michelle, who'd somehow already heard about the court hearing through the small-town gossip network that moved faster than fiber optic internet. "Heard what happened today. You okay? Call me." I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. Wasn't ready to explain or defend or celebrate. I just wanted to sit in the quiet and let the reality settle into my bones like sediment in still water. The house felt different when I walked inside, as if the air itself had changed composition while I was gone. The same furniture sat in the same places. The same coffee cup I'd left on the kitchen counter that morning still held the same ring of cold coffee at the bottom. But everything looked smaller somehow, less significant than it had seemed when I'd left for court that morning. I kicked off the uncomfortable heels Sarah had insisted I wear and padded to the kitchen in my stockings. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor was mowing their lawn with methodical precision. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday afternoon, as if the entire foundation of my family hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. The folder Sarah had given me sat on the kitchen table like a promise and a burden rolled into one. Documents that would transfer ownership of Mom's house. Papers that would give me access to accounts I'd never known existed. Legal forms that would make official what the judge had already declared. I opened it slowly, running my fingers over the clean white pages that represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Mom's house. The phrase felt strange in my mouth when I said it out loud to the empty kitchen. It had always been Mom and Dad's house in my mind, even after she died, even after he'd moved Jessica in like she belonged there. Now it was just mine, along with the responsibility and the memories and the weight of decisions I wasn't sure I was ready to make. The rental property downtown was a different kind of inheritance entirely. I'd only been inside it once, years ago, when Mom had shown me around with the pride of someone who'd worked hard for everything she owned. 2 small apartments above a bakery that had been there since the 1950s, reliable, tenants who paid their rent on time and kept the place clean. Steady income that would give me options I'd never had before. Options. The word rolled around in my head like a marble in an empty jar. For the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't have to calculate whether I could afford groceries and gas in the same week. I wouldn't have to work overtime just to cover unexpected car repairs or medical bills. The freedom felt almost dizzy, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing you could fly. But with the options came questions I'd never had to answer before. Should I move into Mom's house or sell it? Should I keep the rental property or cash out while the market was good? Should I stay in this small town where everyone would always know my business, or use this unexpected windfall to start fresh somewhere new? My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Dad's number flashed on the screen, and my finger hovered over the decline button for a long moment before I finally answered. "Hello, Dad." His voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to talk to me right now, but I need to explain some things." I walked to the window and looked out at the street where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd waited for the school bus every morning for 12 years. What's left to explain? Jessica told me the baby was mine. She showed me ultrasound pictures, talked about names, made plans. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. His voice cracked slightly. "Your mother had been gone for 6 months, and I was so lonely I couldn't see straight." The confession hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Part of me felt sorry for him, for the old man who'd been played by someone young enough to be his daughter. But a bigger part of me remembered the months of legal bills and stress, the nights I'd laid awake worrying about losing everything Mom had worked for. "That doesn't excuse what you did with the estate money," I said quietly. "Or trying to sell the rental property without telling me." "I know." The words came out so soft I almost missed them. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought if I could just get enough money together, I could take care of Jessica and the baby and still make sure you got what your mother wanted you to have. I thought I could fix it all without anyone getting hurt." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him, and it caught me off guard. The dad I'd grown up with never admitted mistakes, never showed vulnerability, never let anyone see behind the curtain of his carefully constructed confidence. "Where is Jessica now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Gone, packed up and left while we were still in court. Took everything I bought her and disappeared like she was never here." His laugh was bitter and tired. 37 years I was married to your mother, and 6 months with a stranger undid all of it." I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass and watched a cat pick its way carefully across the street. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know. The house feels empty without your mother's things in it. And now with Jessica gone too, It's like living in a museum of my own mistakes." He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily. "I might sell it. Downsize to something smaller. Use whatever's left to pay back what I owe the estate." The practical part of me knew that was probably the smartest choice. The house was too big for one person, too expensive to maintain on whatever income he had left. But the sentimental part of me, the part that remembered family dinners around the kitchen table and Christmas mornings in the living room, felt a sharp pang at the thought of strangers living in the rooms where I'd grown up. "Dad," I said, the word feeling strange after everything that had happened. "The money you took from the estate," Sarah said. "It was almost $40,000. "I know. I've been adding it up all afternoon. The trips to Atlantic City, the jewelry for Jessica, that ridiculous car I bought thinking it would make me feel young again." His voice got quieter. "I sold my soul for less than the price of a decent used car." The vulnerability in his voice was so unexpected that it took me a moment to respond. This wasn't the man who'd raised me with an iron fist and a sharp tongue. This was someone broken and lost, finally seeing himself clearly for the first time in decades. "You can pay it back in installments," I heard myself saying. "Sarah mentioned that was an option if you work with the court." "You'd agree to that, after everything I put you through?" I walked away from the window and sat down at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the edge of Sarah's folder. "You're still my father, and Mom wouldn't have wanted you to end up homeless because of your own stupidity." He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with something I'd never heard from him before. "Your mother raised you better than I deserved." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk and thought about forgiveness. Not the kind that erases consequences or pretends hurt never happened, but the kind that chooses to stop carrying poison just because someone else mixed it. Dad would have to live with the choices he'd made, would have to rebuild his life from whatever pieces were left after Jessica's deception. But I didn't have to let his mistakes define the rest of my story. The next morning brought a parade of phone calls and paperwork that made my head spin. The bank needed signatures to transfer accounts. The insurance company needed beneficiary information updated. The property management company that handled the rental units needed to know where to send the monthly checks. Each signature felt like stepping further into a life I'd never imagined for myself. By noon, I was officially the owner of 2 properties and more money than I'd ever seen in one place. By evening, I was exhausted from making decisions about things I'd never had to think about before. Sarah called just as I was heating up leftover Chinese food for dinner. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "The first day after a major inheritance case can be overwhelming." "I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's all a mistake," I admitted, "like I'm going to wake up tomorrow and be broke again." She laughed. "That's normal. Most people don't expect to have their financial situation change overnight. But Sarah, this is real. Your mother planned carefully to make sure you'd be taken care of, and now you are." After dinner, I drove to Mom's house for the first time since the hearing. Dad's car wasn't in the driveway, and the windows were dark, except for a single light in what used to be their bedroom. The key Mom had given me months ago still worked in the front door, lock, though it felt strange using it knowing the house was mine now. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the last time I'd visited. Mom's favorite chair still sat by the window where she used to read in the afternoons. Her coffee mug still waited in the dish drainer by the kitchen sink. Dad had left everything exactly as it was, like a shrine to a life that had ended too soon. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my fingers over furniture that held decades of memories. The dining room table where we'd eaten Sunday dinners, the mantel where Mom had displayed school pictures and report cards, the back porch where she'd taught me to plant tomatoes and told me stories about her own childhood. In the bedroom, I found something that stopped me cold. On Mom's nightstand, next to the lamp she'd used for late-night reading, sat a letter with my name written in her careful handwriting. The envelope was sealed, and underneath it was a note in Dad's messy scrawl. "She asked me to make sure you got this after everything was settled." My hands shook as I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Mom's handwriting was weaker than usual, probably written during her final weeks when holding a pen was difficult. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then the legal battle is over and you've gotten what I worked so hard to leave you. I hope your father didn't make it too difficult, though knowing him as I do, I suspect he tried his best to complicate things." I sat down on the edge of the bed and continued reading through tears that made the words blur together. "I want you to know that every decision I made about the will was intentional. The house isn't just a place to live, it's security. The rental property isn't just income, it's independence. I watched my own mother struggle after my father died because she'd never learned to manage money or make her own decisions. I swore that would never happen to you." Thus, letter went on for another paragraph about practical matters, about the importance of good financial advice and the value of planning for the future, but it was the last few lines that hit me like a physical blow. "Don't let guilt or obligation trap you in a life that's smaller than what you deserve. Your father loves you in his own way, but his love has always come with conditions and expectations. You don't owe him your dreams just because he can't figure out his own. Build something beautiful with what I've given you, and don't look back unless it makes you smile." I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest, feeling Mom's presence in the room as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. Outside, the sun was setting behind the oak tree in the backyard, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the ordinary world look magical. For the first time since the hearing, I felt something that wasn't relief or sadness or confusion. I felt possibility, stretching out in front of me like an open road on a clear morning. Mom had given me more than money or property. She'd given me the chance to write my own story, to make choices based on what I wanted, rather than what others expected. The house would need work. New paint, updated appliances, maybe hardwood floors to replace the worn carpeting. But it had good bones and better memories. The rental property would need attention too, but the income would give me time to figure out what came next without the pressure of immediate financial survival. As I locked the front door and walked back to my car, I made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. I would keep both properties. I would move into Mom's house and make it mine. I would learn to be a landlord and a homeowner and whatever else came with this new chapter of my life. And someday, when enough time had passed for wounds to heal and perspective to settle, maybe Dad and I would find a way to be family again, not the broken, complicated family we'd always been, but something newer and more honest, something Mom would have been proud of. The future felt wide open as I drove home through streets that would always be familiar, but would never look quite the same again. Tomorrow would bring more paperwork and phone calls and decisions. But tonight, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, carrying my mother's love and wisdom into whatever came next. Whatever came next. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe underwater. Every morning brought decisions I'd never had to make before, phone calls from people I'd never heard of, and paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight like weeds in an untended garden. The transition from daughter to property owner happened faster than I could process, leaving me dizzy with responsibility and possibility in equal measure. I moved into Mom's house on a Thursday morning when the October air carried the first real bite of winter. Dad had already cleared out his belongings, leaving behind only the furniture and the ghosts of 37 years of marriage. His absence echoed through the rooms like a song played in a different key, familiar but somehow wrong. The first night alone in that house, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the settling foundation sounded amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. I wandered from room to room, running my fingers along walls that held decades of family history, trying to imagine how to make this space mine without erasing the memory of what it had been. In the kitchen, I found myself standing exactly where Mom used to make her morning coffee, looking out at the backyard where she'd planted roses that still bloomed despite months of neglect. The view was the same, but the perspective had shifted completely. This wasn't the house where I'd grown up anymore. This was home base for whatever came next. The rental property required immediate attention that I wasn't prepared for. Leaky faucet in the upstairs unit had been dripping for weeks, and the downstairs tenant called about a heating issue that sounded expensive over the phone. I spent my first weekend as a landlord learning the difference between a wrench and a pipe wrench, calling repair services, and trying to sound more confident than I felt when discussing square footage and lease agreements. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived in the downstairs apartment for 12 years, took pity on my obvious inexperience and invited me in for coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. Her apartment was tidy as a museum display, every surface covered with doilies and ceramic figurines that watched our conversation with painted eyes. "Your mother was a good landlord," she said, settling into a chair that creaked under her weight. "Never raised the rent more than she had to, always fixed things quick when they broke. She understood that some of us don't have anywhere else to go. The responsibility of that trust settled around my shoulders like a heavy coat." These weren't just rental units, they were people's homes. Mrs. Patterson had raised her grandson in this apartment after his parents died in a car accident. Mr. Chen upstairs sent most of his paycheck to family in Taiwan and lived on ramen noodles and optimism. Their monthly rent payments weren't just income for me, they were the foundation of their stability. I hired a property management company after the second weekend of emergency repair calls, but I insisted on meeting every tenant personally. I wanted to understand what I had inherited along with the buildings, to honor the relationships Mom had built over years of careful attention to both business and humanity. Dad called every few days, usually in the evening when loneliness made his voice thick and uncertain. He'd started seeing a counselor, he told me, someone who specialized in helping older adults navigate major life changes. The sessions were expensive, but he was paying for them by selling off the luxury items he'd bought during his brief romance with Jessica. "The therapist says I was trying to prove I wasn't old," he admitted, during one particularly honest conversation. "Like if I could convince a young woman to love me, I could convince time to stop moving forward." These glimpses of self-awareness from him were as surprising as finding flowers blooming in January. The man who'd spent decades avoiding responsibility for his choices was finally looking in mirrors he'd covered for years. It didn't erase the damage he'd caused, but it suggested the possibility of something different between us eventually. The estate settlement progressed with bureaucratic slowness that tested my patience daily. Sarah guided me through the maze of legal requirements, tax implications, and transfer documents with the steady competence of someone who'd shepherded countless families through similar transitions. Each signature brought me closer to complete ownership, but also deeper into a world of financial responsibility I'd never imagined navigating. "Your mother was smart about the way she structured everything," Sarah explained during one of our monthly meetings. "The rental income will cover the property taxes and maintenance costs with enough left over to give you real financial security. She essentially built you a small business along with a home." The math was staggering when she laid it out in black and white. Between the rental income and the savings accounts Mom had quietly built over decades, I had enough to live modestly without working, or enough to supplement a career I actually wanted rather than one I needed for survival. The freedom felt intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I started taking night classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do but could never afford. Art history, creative writing, basic business management to help me understand the property ownership, responsibilities. For the first time in my adult life, education felt like exploration rather than obligation. The creative writing class met in a basement classroom that smelled like chalk and ambition. Our instructor, Professor Martinez, was a published novelist who worked at the college to pay bills while writing her next book. She had the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter and think more carefully about the words they chose. "Write what you know," she told us during the first session. "But remember that what you know includes everything you've felt, not just everything you've done." I found myself writing about inheritance in ways that had nothing to do with money, about the weight of carrying forward someone else's dreams, about the strange alchemy that transforms grief into gratitude, about learning to trust your own judgment when everyone around you has opinions about your choices. The other students in the class were a mix of retirees, fulfilling lifelong dreams, and working adults stealing time from sleep to chase creative ambitions. We critiqued each other's work with the gentle honesty of people who understood that vulnerability required careful handling. One evening, I read aloud a piece I'd written about the moment the DNA results were announced in court. The room fell silent as I described Dad's face, the way his confidence crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. When I finished, a woman named Grace wiped her eyes and said, "You made me feel sorry for someone who clearly didn't deserve it. That's good writing." The comment stayed with me for weeks. The ability to find humanity in people who'd caused harm, to tell complicated truths without choosing sides, felt like a skill worth developing. Maybe someday I'd write the whole story, not for revenge or vindication, but for understanding. Winter arrived early that year, coating everything in ice that turned the simplest tasks into adventures. I learned to use a snowblower, to check on elderly tenants during cold snaps, to budget for heating bills that seemed to double overnight. The house felt different in winter, smaller and cozier, like it was wrapping itself around me for protection against the cold. Dad spent Christmas Eve with me, the first time we'd been alone together since Mom's funeral. He brought a bottle of wine and a hesitant smile, moving through the familiar rooms like a tourist in his former life. We cooked dinner together, nothing fancy, just roast chicken and vegetables that reminded us both of Sunday dinners from before everything went sideways. "I keep expecting your mother to call us to the table," he said, setting down his fork and looking around the dining room. 37 years of muscle memory don't just disappear. We talked carefully around the edges of everything that had happened, like people walking through a minefield with a map drawn in disappearing ink. He asked about my classes, I asked about his counseling sessions. We discussed the weather, the neighbors, anything that didn't require us to examine the wreckage between us too closely. But as the evening wore on, the conversation grew more honest. He told me about the loneliness that had made him vulnerable to Jessica's manipulation, about the fear of aging that had driven him to make increasingly desperate choices. I told him about the responsibility I felt to honor Mom's memory, about the guilt that came with benefiting from his mistakes. "Your mother always said you were the strongest person she knew," he said as we cleared the dishes. "I used to think she was just being a proud parent, but watching you handle all this, I think she was right." The compliment felt fragile and precious, like something that might break if I examined it too closely. We didn't hug goodbye, weren't ready for gestures that large yet. But when he left, the space between us felt smaller than it had in months. Spring brought new challenges and unexpected opportunities. The upstairs apartment became vacant when Mr. Chen moved to California to be closer to his children. Instead of immediately finding a new tenant, I decided to renovate the space, updating the kitchen and bathroom with modern fixtures while preserving the original hardwood floors and vintage light fixtures. The renovation became my education in property management, teaching me the difference between necessary improvements and expensive mistakes. I learned to read contractor estimates, to spot quality work versus quick fixes, to balance tenant comfort with financial responsibility. Mrs. Patterson became my unofficial advisor, offering opinions on paint colors and appliance choices with the authority of someone who'd lived through decades of landlord decisions. "Your mother always said the secret was to fix things right the first time," she told me while inspecting the new kitchen cabinets. "Costs more up front, but saves money in the long run." The renovated apartment attracted a young family, the Johnsons, who fell in love with the space during their first viewing. Sarah and her husband Mark were both teachers, and their daughter Emma was 4 years old with her mother's bright smile and her father's careful way of examining everything before deciding if she approved. In the end, that DNA test did more than expose a lie. It revealed the truth about who we really are when everything we thought we knew gets stripped away. My father learned that love can't be bought with desperation and money, and I discovered that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what's written in a will, but the strength to stand up for what's right when everyone else is looking the other way. If you've ever felt like the underdog in your own family story, remember this. Truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it and most need it. Sometimes justice comes wrapped in a manila envelope, and sometimes healing begins the moment someone's fake smile finally disappears.